our next speaker. So, Carolyn, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Lindsay Montgomery, who's going to be talking to us about the importance of prevention in the Biennial Review. Lindsay joined the Kennesaw State University Center for Young Adult Addiction and Recovery staff in 2016 as the AOD Prevention Education Coordinator. Lindsay provides trainings to students, faculty, and staff, develops AOD curriculum, develops and facilitates workshops for mandated students, provides education and training in administering naloxone, participates in alcohol and other drug research, and organizes community outreach for AOD education. Lindsay served for 2 years as a board member for the Association of Recovery in Higher Education and is currently chair of the Kennesaw State Alcohol, Tobacco, and Other Drug Education and Prevention Coalition. Thank you so much for being here today, Lindsay, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that. And I actually got the pleasure of serving with Susie. So this is a really exciting time because we serve together on the ARHE board. And so when Susie asked me to be here today, I was like, absolutely. I love to get involved with the other board members and really kind of bridge that gap between prevention work and recovery work. One of the things that we frequently see in both the prevention sphere as well as the recovery sphere is they're kept very separate a lot of times. And so as a person in long-term recovery myself, and as somebody who came up in collegiate recovery, I really am passionate about prevention work because I feel like there's a lot that people in recovery can contribute to that prevention work, right? We've been through it. We know how this goes. And so we've been down that road of the entire continuum of substance use, right? And so I serve as the Alcohol and Other Drug Prevention and Education Coordinator for Kennesaw State University. I am very fortunate that my position is housed within the Center for Young Adult Addiction and Recovery, which is also where our collegiate recovery community is housed. And so we really have this full spectrum of alcohol and other drug prevention, education, research, and recovery all in the same space within our university. And so we're able to really collaborate and work together on that. And then one of the other things that we do is one of our staff here at the Center for Young Adult Addiction and Recovery is always one of the co-chairs of our Alcohol, Tobacco, and Other Drug Prevention and Education Coalition. And so that is another really big step in bringing all the people to the table who contribute to prevention work, to AOD education work across the university. We have representatives from all over the university that serve on that coalition, so we can deliver consistent messaging that we can have prevention work in all of these spaces where prevention work may not necessarily be obvious, right? And so we have this ability to be able to have these conversations and like, how do we really create this culture here at Kennesaw State that not only supports students in recovery, but is also not an abstinence hostile environment. I will say it's really, it's hard to follow up Tom Coderre. I will throw that out there. And the whole time he was speaking, I was just like, yes. But he really hit on some of those really important points that I'm going to kind of like highlight and expand on in my time here. So I am going to share slides. I am absolutely terrible at this, so y'all forgive me every time I manage to mess up this sharing process. We'll see how it goes, right? Please tell me you're looking at slides.
Yes, we are, Lindsay.
Oh, thank goodness, because I can't see the chat or anything now. Teams is like, for some reason, I just can't figure out. It's what we use at our university, and for some reason, I cannot figure out how to be able to see multiple things at once. So I'm just kind of flying blind, looking at my own slides here. But I'll go ahead and skip this first one. So I'm going to start out talking about the biennial review for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of completing a biennial review, contributing to a biennial review. But basically what that is the Drug-Free Schools and Community Act, Part 80, Edgar Part 86, states that all institutes of higher education, or IHEs, must implement some kind of program and policy to prevent substance use on campuses, distribution, any kind of storage, possession, anything like that. And so these policies have to be very well documented. They have to be widely available. They have to be distributed to students, faculty, and staff at universities. And then every 2 years, a document, so the biennial review, has to be compiled to outline all of the prevention and intervention programs that are going on across campus. It also kind of highlights what is going on in our student conduct offices, and are these standards of conduct that have to do with alcohol and other drugs, is there a consistent sanctioning process with that? The biennial review is an interesting document because you do this every 2 years, and just for, again, those of you who haven't had the great pleasure of doing a biennial review, I'm the one who does it here at Kennesaw State. Our last one was 102 pages, so it is a very, very large document, and it takes a minute, but once this document is compiled every 2 years, you don't actually turn it in anywhere. It's not like you send it off to have anybody analyze it and review it and tell you if you get a good grade or not, but it does have to be available upon request. The Department of Education can request that from any institute of higher education that is getting any kind of federal funding whatsoever, and we must be able to produce that most recent updated document at any time. And anybody who doesn't have that document available, if they're asked for it, can lose federal assistance. They can have to repay assistance that they've received, or they can be hit with very, very serious fines for this. And so the biennial review can seem like a massive undertaking. It can seem like, oh my gosh, why do we have to do all this? And it just kind of sits around usually, right? But what we have found is that the biennial review is actually a wonderful springboard to be able to have conversations across campus. It is a federal mandate. It's something that we have to do. It's something that we have to complete. Obviously, with the threat of having any kind of, federal funding pulled, it's something that we don't really want to mess around with. And so it's taken very seriously by all upper administration at institutes of higher education, or at least it should be. And so knowing that, we're able to actually leverage the biennial review to be able to have conversations across campus about what are we doing and how can we do it better. And so with that, we know that a thorough biennial review, according to any kind of guides that are out there, talks about the AOD program elements and what those are, and the goals, the outcomes, what we're doing, why we're doing it. It also highlights strengths and weaknesses. And so that's a really, really important one, because it gives everybody the opportunity to be able to look at the AOD programming that's happening across campuses and talk about where are we doing really well and where do we need work? What are we seeing that needs some adjustment and improvement, and who do we need to talk to be able to make those improvements? The procedures for distributing annual AOD notification is included in the biennial review. Any copies of the AOD policy or policies, most universities have at least one, but probably more than one. I know I've been compiling ours here at Kennesaw State, and we have one very large overarching AOD policy, but then we also have more AOD policies within different colleges and universities, or different colleges within the university. And so, like, our nursing department has a separate AOD policy that kind of goes into more detail. Our housing here on campus has their own AOD policy. And so it gives us an opportunity to review all those and make sure that we're consistent in all of our AOD policy work. And then there's obviously recommendations for revising that are also included in the biennial review. So when we talk about the biennial review, it actually doesn't have any specific format that it has to be in. It's not like there's a template that you can download and it's just all right there and you fill in the blanks. It's kind of dealer's choice on that one, and you get to kind of fill it out however you see fit to meet those 6 kind of bullet points that I talked about on the last slide. But pretty much everybody is in agreement that there should be a multifaceted approach to prevention work, intervention work, any kind of AOD education on college campuses. And so usually we talk about that in regards to the social ecological model. It's a really great way to organize this. It gives a really helpful format for kind of evaluating and looking at AOD programs, as well as organizing what needs to happen and where. So when we talk about prevention work on college campuses, sometimes we kind of go with the obvious, right? There's prevention work has been done on college campuses for a very, very, very long time. There's a lot of it that we've just been doing over and over and over again. But some of that obvious kind of stuff is not always everything we need to do. And so there's a lot of things that get overlooked, and there's different areas that we could be looking at a little bit better. And so I love this example that comes up when we talk about World War II and anti-aircraft fire. And so during World War II, the RAF, they were losing a lot of planes to German anti-aircraft fire. And so the RAF got together and they were like, we really need to put some more armor on our planes so that, you know, if they're getting fired at, they'll actually be able to make it back to us safely, and we won't have downed planes, and we're not going to lose as many planes to this. And so when they were analyzing where to put this armor, what they were doing is they were looking at planes that had come back from different war areas and zones where there was heavy anti-aircraft fire. And so all of these planes would come back, they would be riddled with bullet holes. Most of them were grouped in these areas. And so the obvious answer was to put more armor in these areas where they had the most bullet hole groupings, right? Like, this is clearly where they're taking the most fire. But then one of the scientists finally went, we're approaching this wrong, because these are the planes that made it back. And so we actually need to be putting the extra armor in these other places where there aren't a lot of bullet holes, right? Because they took a lot of fire to these areas, but these planes made it back. They're okay. It's the ones that didn't make it back that we need to be concerned about. And so this is a really great way to look at how we approach prevention work on college campuses as well. You know, when we talk about which planes didn't make it back and where do we need the armor, we can find that answer in our conduct offices. Our conduct offices hold a lot of those answers right there, right? Where is it that we've not armored up enough? What's happening on our campuses? Where are the conduct situations happening? And those are our planes that didn't make it back. There's another way to look at this as well as, you know, when we talk about collegiate recovery programs and collegiate recovery communities, they are students who have made it back, thank goodness. But a lot of them, and I would say like a huge majority of the students in collegiate recovery that I've ever interacted with in my time working in collegiate recovery, most of them have some kind of story where they started at a college or university and something happened and now they're back in recovery. And so looking at their stories and like, what was it that took that plane down, right? What was it? Where could we have put more armor in your story? So that brings us to recovery-informed education. And so with recovery-informed theory, basically what that does is it takes the lived experiences of people in recovery and applies it to all these different areas, and it utilizes those stories and it utilizes the experience of people to be able to take that out into other areas. We are big ones here for recovery-informed education and prevention work. What that does for us here at Kennesaw State and all the different universities that have implemented recovery-informed education is it provides this network for students who might be thinking about recovery, who might be recovery curious, but it also normalizes the recovery experience on a college campus. It gives peer-based services. It gives people a place to go if they're like, I don't know, maybe I am struggling, maybe I'm not, maybe I'm concerned about a friend. And so it gives them that ability to interact with somebody that has that recovery identity. It has that impact on how we talk about substances on a college campus. Because sometimes, even with the best of intentions, we don't do a great job about talking about substances, right? Sometimes, in an effort to actually reduce substance use, we normalize it. We talk about, like, well, this is the normative experience for college students, and like, but it's not. And so being able to come from that recovery informed viewpoint, be able to apply recovery informed theory to all of the education and prevention work that we do on campuses is an absolutely incredible way to be able to utilize that lived experience of the people in recovery that are on college campuses. Whether we see them or not, we have them here. But the other thing that recovery informed education does, because a lot of people who come from that recovery lens, if you ask them, what would have stopped you? A lot of times they'll be like, nothing. I went through DARE, I went through these different programs, I had ADAP classes and all of that, but it didn't really stop me. And so the question isn't what would have stopped you, right? Because that can be really disheartening if we come from that lens. Rather, we ask, what do you wish you would have known? And in asking, what do you wish you would have known, we actually get this rich ability to be able to take that experience and apply it on the front end of a spectrum. And we get all kinds of answers when we ask that. And then we can take that and put that directly into our prevention programming. The other thing with prevention that I think is really important to keep in mind as well is it's hard. Anybody who works in prevention programming deals with this struggle. It's hard to measure, and it's hard to say, look, we did a really great job, because true prevention work, if you did a really good job, nothing happens, right? Like it's kind of the issue with prevention work is like, we're doing a great job. How do you know? Nothing happens. And everybody's like, that's not how this works. You can't measure that. And so it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about prevention work and things like that, we do need to look, again, where are those planes that didn't come back? That's kind of what we need to be measuring. Do we have a reduction of that? Do we have a reduction of any kind of harms that are happening on college campuses? Do we have more people entering collegiate recovery? Is it more people who are asking for help and getting into these spaces and things like that? Are we normalizing that experience of substance-free or abstinent college life? I'm going to blow through this very quickly because I know I don't have a ton of time here. But when we talk about substance use disorder prevention, a really good way to look at that is by looking, and I'm going to bring these all up. I know it's a lot of text. We can look at the phases. These are the Prime for Life phases that kind of go down the continuum of substance use disorder, but these also provide the touchstones for our prevention work. And so when we talk about how do we stop things from happening, we can kind of look at these different phases and how people progress up this scale to kind of figure out where do we need to put in that prevention work, what is needed, what do we need to do to be able to do that. I personally adopt kind of a Trojan horse approach to this. Most students aren't really big in participating in prevention work, right? The students who are very involved in prevention work either are in recovery or don't need that prevention work. They're typically the ones that are already abstaining, that aren't very heavily involved in substance use or anything like that. And so I prefer an approach where we kind of sneak it in with other things. Naloxone training is a big one for us. We can train somebody how to use naloxone and spot an overdose in just a few minutes. It's not a difficult process. However, we offer an hour-long training in naloxone where we also cover things like stigma reduction, and we do a lot of that prevention kind of language and framework inside that naloxone training. Because students want to be trained in naloxone, especially in specific high-risk groups. And so For example, a lot of our students in our fraternity and sorority life will do chapter trainings for naloxone. Well, they'll have their whole chapter trained. We'll provide them with a few kits. And so if they have get-togethers, not right now because of COVID, but when they have these parties and these things like that, they're equipped. Everybody knows what to do. They're trained and they have that naloxone on hand in case something happens. And so they're very driven to have that training, but we also sneak in some prevention work in there. And so by following kind of this idea of where are our students at, meeting them where they're at, and providing that prevention work in those spaces in between, we can hit prevention, intervention, we can hit them along all lines of that continuum. And I will say that one of the big things, if there is collegiate recovery on a campus, it should be very visible. It cannot be overstated how important it is for recovery to be visible on a college campus. Having recovery visible is in itself prevention work. And I believe that's something that kind of gets missed because, again, we tend to separate those things. And so there's a lot of different options for being able to provide visibility. One of them is just having CRP representatives present for any kind of alternative programming events. And so when we provide this alternative programming during high-risk times of year or high-risk holidays, things like that, having a large CRP presence there, whether it's staff, students, and really normalizing that idea of like not everybody's interacting in these high-risk areas, in these high-risk groups, and normalizing that idea of you don't have to be using substances to have a good time in college. Also, incorporating recovery support services into AOD programming. We make it very clear in all of our programming that has anything to do with alcohol or other drugs that we have resources available here on campus. We talk about off-campus resources. We go into some of the local community resources. And so having that is just part of the process of developing that programming and making sure that it's very visible is incredibly important to us. And we start all of our prevention programming with that message. But then we also make sure that there's always collegiate recovery representation when we talk about the biennial review process. Whoever's involved in the biennial review, I know a lot of universities are moving to more of a committee responsible for the biennial review. We always have collegiate recovery, and we always encourage other universities to have collegiate recovery representatives who are on that team that is responsible for the biennial review. And so going back to the social ecological model that we were talking about earlier, what does that actually mean? So when we talk about starting from the inside, that individual level, that can be kind of broad and inclusive when we talk about prevention. Because again, it's not always the obvious answer. It's not always the very direct messaging that serves as really good prevention programming. And so at the individual level, we can talk about things like personal value clarification. And so having students really understand their own personal values. And so instead of telling them, don't do drugs are bad, we talk about what is it that's important to you? What do you want to achieve? Where do you want to go? How are you going to do that? We also talk about resource knowledge at that individual level, refusal skills. So that ability for a student to be able to be like, no, thanks, I don't want that. And what does that mean for them? And how do they approach that when they are presented with an opportunity to participate in alcohol or other drug use? But then also future self-reflection. And so again, looking at that, where do I want to be? What do I want to do when I leave here? And what could possibly get in the way of that? At that interpersonal level, that's where we can hit a lot with the different groups on campus. And so that might be registered student organizations, that might be your fraternity and sorority life. With our athletes, there's a lot of these different groups across campus that are typically categorized as high risk, but it doesn't even necessarily need to be high risk groups. But at that level, we can have these ideas of what are those group values? What is it that you have come together as a group and really identified as what's important to you? With all of our RSOs, with our Greek organizations, with our athletes, when we walk into these spaces where we're able to provide prevention programming, we always start with, what are the values of your organization? What do y'all care about? What brought you together and why did you join? And have that conversation and have them tell us what's important to them. Because if you think about what that means for, say, a Greek organization, I'll ask, what are your group values? Why did you join? And a lot of people will tell us the values of their chapter. They're written down, right? They have to memorize them as part of joining. And they'll tell us that, and it's like, all right, well, what part of that brotherhood or sisterhood includes letting your friend get so drunk they fall down a flight of stairs and crack their head? And it really makes them stop and think for a moment, right? Like, really identifying, like, oh, these are the people I care about. These are the people that I've chosen to spend all this time with. And it really allows them to identify within themselves what they care about and how they're going to get to that level and how they're going to watch out for each other. Bystander intervention is also in this interpersonal level, and then social skills training. If we talk about how to have good social skills in different places, that's also prevention work. A lot of college students, if you look at all the different reports, when they report, why did you drink heavily, a lot of them will report, like, it made socializing easier. It's a social lubricant. We all know that. And so by developing those social skills and by being able to go into those spaces and not have that kind of intense, like, I need to have a drink in my hand to be okay in this space, we're actually doing prevention work. At the organizational level, we talk about campus culture. What does that look like on your campus? Is there events on campus? And again, I go back to this. Sometimes when we talk about alcohol and other drugs, we don't do a great job. If we have different events on campus called Get Toasted, the French Toast Social, it's not exactly a great way to not normalize substance use. I know we had one here, and it was the Get Lit Chaser, and it was a glow-in-the-dark fun run. And it was like, that might not be the best way to go about doing things. And I know we're more creative than that. But all of that contributes to this campus culture. And there are ways that we can really influence how that happens and have those conversations with students. This is also where we get into policy conversations at this organizational level. And so what are the campus policies? What does the AOD policy look like? Is it fair? Is it equitable? Is there any kind of ways for modification, change, to make things better, to make things more clear? That should be looked at frequently. When we get to that community level, we're talking about committee and coalition work. We're talking about the relationships between the institution, the surrounding businesses. If there's a lot of bars, restaurants, things like that around a university, what does that university and outward community relationship look like, and how can they work together to make sure that we're making the best decisions for our students? This is also where we see a lot of community work with local recovery community organizations and different resources off campus for students to get embedded in. And then with public policy, we're talking about things like making people know about Good Samaritan laws, medical amnesty laws, naloxone distribution in the area. What is the relationship with this local and the state law enforcement? How do those come together? Do the way that the local law enforcement and the university law enforcement work together, is it consistent? Is there consistent enforcement? This is also where we see a lot of the grant work that happens. A lot of these grants come from different areas that public policy has large influence on directly with our students. And this is also where we work with local media, the campaigns, the positive social norming, and things like that. These are some resources for the biennial review that I highly recommend. And so I will also send these slides over. But again, there's no explicit format for the biennial review. And so there's a few different ways that you can look at this. The Guide for University and College Administrators, that is a fantastic kind of outline of what should be included in there. These sample biennial reviews are great biennial reviews to model after. And then that Resurgence of the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, a call to action, also has a lot of great resources and kind of how the biennial review process really looks, and kind of a step-by-step. A lot. Tried to get through that as quickly as humanly possible so that if anybody had any questions, I can definitely answer. We can have some conversation. Do I have any time left? Am I out of time?
You've got about a minute.
I'm yours. Anything I can address for anybody. All right. Well, I very much appreciate you having me today. I really enjoyed it. I crammed a 45-minute presentation into 30 minutes, so I am so sorry if I went really, really fast. I apologize. There was a lot in there that I feel like is really important to be able to bridge that gap.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was great. And we'll provide your contact information should folks have questions that they want to reach you about later. So we really appreciate you being here, and you did a great job following up after Tom.
Thank you. Yeah, that actually made me very nervous. I was like, man, I gotta follow Tom Codere. Are you serious right now?
I think Lisa Lateman actually has a quote. We do have a hand up.
Hi there. Thank you. I'm sorry it took me a minute to figure out how to do that. I had a question about states that have now recreational marijuana, like New Jersey. And I was wondering if you know of any information from the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act about how we communicate the differences between state law and federal law to our students, because it's already confusing.
So I'm here in Georgia. We do not have recreational cannabis use here in Georgia yet. I'm sure it's coming. And so I haven't dug too deep into it just yet. However, I know that when I talk to a lot of my colleagues in other areas that have recreational cannabis use, they're approaching it the exact same way, where they've always talked about cannabis use on college campuses, where federal law tells us it's still a Schedule I drug. We still have to enforce as a Schedule I drug. That doesn't change here just because it changed out there, because we get federal funds. And so we have to enforce federal policy. And so I know that that has been the messaging that everyone I've talked to in these different states have gone with, is nothing's changed for us. But that was a very long way to say I don't actually know of any specific resources off the top of my head, but I am sure there's somebody in this room who does.
So there was a really good webinar back in December, and the presenter, his name escapes me, but he is an attorney, and he spoke to this exact topic, and I believe it was hosted by the Higher Ed Center, but I've got the link to that recording that I can send out to folks, because it was very, very good.
I actually did see that one, and that was a really good, and God, I can't remember his name either, but he spoke so well.
Yeah, he was great. Well, thank you again, Lindsay. We are going to take about a minute break and get ready for our next session. Stay safe down there.